The CCCR, or Centre for Creative and Cultural Research, investigates the ancient, innovative relationship between social culture and creative production. Based in the Faculty of Arts and Design at the University of Canberra, we generate scholarship and artwork in a wide array of humanities, social science, applied and creative disciplines. You are listening to a fresh presentation from the CCCR's Culture and Creativity Seminar Series. The presentation was delivered with slides. To view those slides, or to learn more about the Centre's work, please follow the links in the program notes. This podcast was recorded on the unceded lands of the Ngunnawal and Ngambri peoples.
With me is Natalie, Ison,
who is a long-standing colleague in heritage academia. She's a conservator. She came onto this project as a research assistant, saw the particular implications for museums, and she's built her PhD around that. And also working alongside us is our wonderful industry reference group, who we've got some of online today. And that's a flexible group of people who are all private owners or volunteers working with operating heritage machinery. And in particular, I'd like to give a shout out to Neil Hogg, who started the peak body Operating Heritage Australia to conduct research and to do advocacy for this sector. So we're going to run this talk as a bit of a conversation because, frankly, as we started preparing for this talk, we're thinking, the situation is changing under our feet as we speak. And so we've tried to update what we saw as our research focus and our questions to something that really covers a bit more of what we're seeing today.
So I'm going to give you a bit of a background on what our world situation's like, and then Alison will tell you more about our project. But we know we have a climate situation, and the way we're reacting to it will have impacts on the way we live. In summary, the amount of carbon, particularly carbon dioxide, that we have been emitting is at quantities that make it really hard for our Earth systems to cycle it back out of our atmosphere. And this has resulted in a thick blanket of it in our atmosphere, which literally does act like a blanket, and it prevents heat from escaping back into space. So the heat is resulting in worsening climate-related weather events, hotter overall temperatures, as well as having knock-on effects for like biodiversity, food production, general well-being, and civil and geopolitical stability. The attempts that world governments have made to mitigate this are in reducing the amount of emissions we make, and the most significant one of these was the Paris Agreement in 2015, which aims for the world to reduce net zero emissions, aiming for net zero by 2050. The aim of this is so we can limit our global warming to 1.5 degrees above pre-industrial levels Celsius. That way, the way our countries are proposing to achieve this is a bit different depending on the country, but it's by making significant reductions in greenhouse gas emissions. And in Australia, there are milestones earmarked for 2030 and 2035, respectively. In 2019, for instance, energy industry, transport and building sectors contributed nearly 79% of global greenhouse gases. So the idea is to reduce some of the use of that sector from those sectors. Most operating heritage machinery fits into the category of transport if it's categorised at all. Some will also be incorporated into industry and potentially also energy sectors. So reductions in emissions in these sectors might have some impacts on operating heritage machinery that relies on fossil fuels to run. We're already seeing some movement in subsidies for electric vehicles and solar panel installations, closures of gas and power plants. In the ACT, we've had 100% renewable energy since 2020.
There are two things driving these closures. One is businesses are actually starting to take
advantage of the new business environment, those net zero government implemented net zero measures are creating. But the other one is also that coal and gas companies are already seeing their profits drop. And big companies are really not interested in small profits. So we're seeing early closures of the coal mines and so forth and there's a gas plant in Western Australia that's just closed because the companies don't see enough profits in them anymore. So This project started because of fears for this operating heritage machinery sector. I'm just going to take a step back. What is operating heritage machinery? Well, heritage, anything that we inherit from the past and feel is important to bring into the present or hand on to the future. Machinery, anything mechanical, multiple components that can be moved in relation to each other to perform a function, and operating, able to perform a sequence of actions. Operation requires a power source, some form of energy to get things moving. And the OHA definition, Operating Heritage Australia, is any type of heritage object that is used regularly to demonstrate its original form and function. So that's a particular nod to what people do these things as heritage. And as Natalie said, the bulk of these things are transport machines. And operating heritage machines are owned and run and maintained by private owners on the one hand, but also larger government-funded museums and smaller private museums, some of which get a bit of government funding but are also semi-privately funded. And Nat will talk more about why people keep these machines and run them in a moment. But the bulk of heritage preserved in operating condition now are from the 20th century, is a bit from before that, but the bulk of it is 20th century. And that means that the most common power source in heritage machines today is the classic internal combustion engine. And that, of course, is fueled by fossil fuels. And those are fuels derived from the extraction of crude oil. Steam power is a good second. Some of that's fueled by coal, some of it by wood. But yeah, so a lot of fossil fuels in this area. And I'm going to use the term fossil fuels as a shorthand for both fuels, but also lubricants, because many of those are also based on crude oil extraction. And in fact, some of them, particularly for older machines, they can act as lubricant or fuel, depending on how they're used. So in a world that's already started, as Natalie pointed out, to move away from the internal combustion engine to reduce carbon emissions, the heritage machinery sector is sort of stuck, a bit like a rock in the middle of a river. Things are moving past it, but it's stuck because the heritage of these machines is very closely bound up with their motive power. So we were worried that as big companies are not interested in small profits, a move away from fossil fuels as that becomes more mainstream, could we see that extraction and refining and distribution facilities could get discontinued really suddenly? And we thought that might happen particularly in regional areas where distances are big and transporting fuel is costly. And remember, we're not talking about what's good for the country. Right, okay. All right. I'll stay away, Mike. But what is good for the big corporations? And so we thought this sort of market restriction might make fossil fuels very expensive and even just hard to get at all, especially in regional areas. And so we wondered how people would deal with this. Let's go to our next.
I'm on it. Keep talking.
Right, all right. Sorry. So we thought, what would it be like to run machines on fossil fuels in a net zero world? Would people feel conflicted? Would they be criticised by other sectors of society?
And in museums, are they kind of in conflict with net zero policies that they need to adhere to and adapt for? And also, like, are they allowed to keep using fossil fuels? And are they also like communicating initiatives about how to mitigate climate change and whether there's tension there? So that was what attracted me to that.
Do you have an exhibition in one gallery of how to mitigate climate change, and in the other gallery some operating machines using fossil fuels? It's a bit of a mixed message. So the next one we thought of was, how central are fossil fuels to what people see as most significant about their machines? Do they see changing their machines to another motive power as destroying what they actually value most in their machines? And if people did convert their machines to run on something like electricity, would those machines be allowed to have a historic registration? That's a regulatory issue. Would they maintain acceptance within the broader community? That's a values issue. And would they be allowed to be part of historic machinery clubs, which is a social issue? So might you find that people are actually being evicted from their social communities around these machines because suddenly their machine doesn't fit the brief of the car club anymore, or whatever club they're in?
So we've talked about our physical machines, but then we've also as a group spent a lot of time considering what people feel about the significance of their machines. What do they value about them? What makes them buy them and spend time and money on them? And in both personal and organisational collections, people derive pleasure from doing these things up, seeing them as an investment, potential inheritances, and also not to be underestimated is the huge value they provide in allowing owners to connect with one another. Like they do things by researching, which one of our industry reference group members called me and she was like, I found your article on like leather because somebody had asked her about plastic coated materials. So that was really fun. I've witnessed a bunch of troubleshooting at like group meetings, like car club meetings and that kind of stuff, online conversations, sharing, interpreting, like all of that. In museums, these things are used to tell a range of stories, not just about fossil fuel use, like land use, connection, but also extraction, class structures, government policy, like a whole heap of stuff these things are used to tell these stories. We know owning these machines is important to people for so many reasons. On the surface, you immediately think it's just using them to get from A to B, right? There's a lot of experiential value in driving these things down the road and having people look at you and be like, oh my God, that's so cool. Like I've had that, it's amazing. But underneath, and also, sorry, thinking about bigger machines, like people working together to get big machines to work, like trains and ships, like it's a team effort. And that's important too, because you're working toward a goal and that can't be underestimated. So underneath, this industry relies almost entirely on volunteer labour. If it's a business, but also if it's a private owner, like if you're a private owner, you don't get paid for it. You do it because you love it. Overwhelmingly, whether overtly acknowledged or not, is a wellbeing angle. Being part of a team or a group, working together to make something go and helping other people. Sharing that experience with other people, even passing the knowledge on, so like intergenerational, which I'll talk about because I've had that experience, but also like older and more experienced brains passing that information on to people who haven't learnt that. Like that's incredible. The other thing is that these things go boom, boom, and people love these things because of the sound and the vibrations that they make. Like everyone, like you're laughing and you can feel it in your chest when it's big, right? And that's all down to the fact that that boom, boom is a result of like the explosions that are happening because of the fuel that's inside them. The other issue that we don't really think about as much is even if it doesn't go boom, 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 or putter, 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 can't discard the smaller ones. If it has moving components, they need to have lubrication, which is often also fossil fuel based. So to find out more about how much fossil fuel based fuel and lubricant heritage machinery might actually use, we did a survey in 2024. Operating Heritage Australia had already done some information collection when they asked people what sort of machines they had and how they might be significant. And I'm putting in a plug right now. It was done as part of their data collection for their Australia's Movable Technology Heritage Treasures program, which lists 100 significant machines. It's on their website, which is accessible through Big Stuff. And yeah, around Australia. So you've got some really great machines that they've found out about there and listed. Back to this survey though, members of Operating Heritage Australia are part of our industry reference group, and some of them, as Alison said, are online today. We built this survey on the Qualtrics platform and it was open for more than 6 months, and we got more than 1,000 people telling us about often more than one of their machines. Our overall aim was to get quantities, to see if we could demonstrate that there was a viable market for alternative or greener fuels to be developed so that we can then talk to producers and government and say, hey, look at this. We also asked them for their opinions, so the respondents for their opinions, like about this topic, but also what they would do if they couldn't get or afford their fuel anymore. And we got some really cool responses about that. The survey gave us an idea of how much they use their machines in a year and how much fossil fuel-based product might have been used there. That then allowed for an extrapolation on the amount of machines that might be in the country to have some estimates of possible overall fuel consumption and lubricant consumption. Yeah, and I'm still crunching this data, and I'm going to shout out to Young Lee, who is helping me do that, and I'm so grateful to her for that. A slight offshoot for my PhD, you'll see a tiny number up there that says 5%. It's actually under 5% of the data set that is museums and organisations. Alison's pointing that out. I've got a little pointer guy, but it doesn't seem to love me right now. Whatever. Yeah, so that's given me a snapshot of this sector, but it's shown me I can't really rely on the organisational figures I've been given. Some of them are great, but the sector's a lot bigger than what is essentially 3% of the survey actually tells me. So I need to get this group in another way, which is amazing.
Anyway, so in the relatively quiet days of 2023, when we sort of kicked this project off, the World Energy Outlook report noted geopolitical stability as a risk to energy supply, but same old, same old. It's always been that way.
So as mentioned above, we thought that any new risk for fossil
fuel use for heritage would be big companies closing as people gradually adopted renewables. But then, of course, oh my God, the fuel crisis. And in February this year, everything changed, and Donald Trump decided that he wanted to become Salesman of the Year for renewables, which he's been very successful in. I have to, thank you for that. But suddenly fossil fuels are not just something that people should move away from for the sake of the planet. Suddenly they're a real in-your-face cost of living issue. And more than that, they're a critical material that Australia seems to now be always just days away from running out of. So this qualitative change is actually making a qualitative difference. And this is where we sort of came up against our research is just sort of what we were trying to do is sliding bias. That's almost in the past now. This quantitative change is speeding up the timeline for the impacts that we expected. So fossil fuels are becoming very expensive and are becoming hard to get at all, but it's also making other fault lines a lot clearer. What we're seeing at the moment is that electric vehicles and hybrids are becoming normalised as part of daily life a lot quicker than we expected. And I think that's probably because they actually help people regain a sense of control over their energy source and over the costs that they're facing. So EVs are now 20% of all new cars sold, and EVs and hybrids together are 50% of all new cars sold. And that's all since the beginning of this year. So if this rate of change continues, it's pretty likely to reduce the availability of parts and skills for maintaining internal combustion engines. And this may start to, because there's already a significant reduction in the actual market for those engines. So that follow-on tail of maintenance is going to start evaporating as well. And this, I think, may lead people to some very practical, very pragmatic decisions. Firstly, they might decide they are going to sell off heritage machines that they can't afford to run any longer. And we did see a bit of people saying that in the survey, not a lot. But
not a lot.
Not a lot, but a little bit. But maybe that's starting to be more. We don't know. But they also might start to sell off heritage machines that they'd regarded as personal and family investments. Because if those things are dropping in value, then keeping something as an asset or handing it on to your children may not be the bonus that it once looked like. On the other side of things, if people that might have been going to buy a car, say when they're retired and start doing it up and it's all, the car they've always wanted, maybe starting to think twice about that. So we could find that if we're in a position where a lot of people are suddenly trying to sell their heritage machines, and that includes museums as well, who may have deaccessioning policies that they start putting in place, and less people are buying them, then I think there's a real potential for the market for these vehicles to crash. And the market in terms of monetary value and emotional value, there's two sort of markets there, but they work together. They're not completely separate. So suddenly I think we're standing on a precipice instead of a slope. If there's not enough time for that market to adapt, which we thought there would be, more or less, but if there isn't, then it could be devastating for the preservation of these machines, but also for the preservation of people's life's work and their social network. All these things Natalie was talking about, important hands-on skills, intergenerational connections, and also social tourism and economic value, because there are many fabulous events around the country every year that are based on these machines, and they draw people out to those areas. People spend money in those areas, and those areas are suffering because of these very same problems. So if they're losing that sort of income from people going out there to see these machines, that's another. It's a huge shame. It's a shame. This stuff is fascinating, and people have huge investments in it.
As do museums. Yeah.
As do museums. Yep. Yeah.
So we had our survey data and we were using it, and I'm interested in it, and it's still very, very relevant. And during this fuel shortage and the closure of the Strait of Hormuz, I did actually enjoy seeing some of the warning headlines about stockpiling fuel and making your own fuel come out, because some of the survey respondents had been like, I'll just do that. I was like, they told me that was going to happen. In Australia, the speed of this response has to be accounted for too. So on the 18th of August, so I'm glad we didn't do our presentation before then, the government announced a $14.8 billion fuel security and resilience package that is proposed to, quote, protect Australians from global fuel shocks, put downward pressure on costs, and accelerate the transition to our own homegrown sovereign fuels, end quote, specifically by building a low carbon liquid fuels industry in Australia, securing an extra 10 days of fuel reserve, and also from a meeting in July, doing a feasibility study of an oil refinery located in Western Australia. So there's much more movement a lot quicker than we were anticipating when we started this survey. Now, this has then massaged our research question from our first one into two. So our first question was, how do we ensure that there's a stream of carbon-based fuels available for fossil fuel-powered machines? And I do think this is still relevant, even though the speed of, investment has increased. Because regardless of Australia's attachment to the mining and usage of fossil fuels, which is a very real thing, our fuel supply is subject to supply and demand, and the policy and prioritisation for the government of the day. So Australian political parties differ in their agreement of the approach to net zero policies and how they would strive for it. So, there's a bunch of variety within different political parties' opinions on net zero. So also the assumption that fossil fuels will always be around and therefore able to be purchased as the whole world potentially moves away from their use and toward their own sovereign homegrown fuels. Is also, it can't be assumed that we're always going to have access to this as regular private citizens, and it can't be relied upon the further away we get from now. So when looking at projections of the Department of Transport, Infrastructure, Regional Development, Communications, Sport and the Arts in 2025 in their Transport and Infrastructure Roadmap and Action Plan, I'm good at this. They're proposing that at the point between 2035 and 2050, that the light vehicle fleet will be completely electrified with widespread provision of EV charging infrastructure, and fossil fuels to be used, quote, only used in very specific circumstances. And I think depending on where you live is still a factor in how easily you'll be able to procure fuel for your internal combustion engine machine and how much you pay for it, particularly if nobody else wants it. But there's also a bunch of philosophical questions which we'll play with now, and they all hinge around our second question about what are people trying to preserve exactly?
And I'll also just go back briefly to what you were saying before about there have been moves. There's a pilot plant for making e-fuels, which is drawing down carbon. And so, carbon is the same stuff. But there's just one in Tasmania. That's been being built for a few years now. So if we do want to go to drop-in replacements for crude oil-based fuels or fossil fuels, then it's going to take a fair while to get it up and running to the point where it could service the whole of the country. So I think for certainly some while, it's going to be very prioritised sectors of the machinery world, which are going to be given access to those fuels if they're in high demand. Anyway, let's take a little excursion into value propositions. So as time moves on, if you want to keep a machine operating, you cannot have everything original everywhere all at once because things change. And I'm going to use Puffing Billy as an example. Puffing Billy is the heritage railway down in Victoria, dearly beloved. And I did some research on this when I was doing my own PhD research. First of all, parts wear out and have to be replaced. Significantly, things like boilers. If your boiler is getting a bit old and developing a few bits of metal fatigue and a few cracks, then it's likely to explode. That's not going to please anyone. It's not going to please the regulator or the inspector or the people that are horribly killed and injured. So that's the boom you don't want.
Yeah, that's not a good boom. Bad booms.
So you've got to replace parts. It's not all as dramatic as that, but you do have to replace things. The present day context and expectations for these machines actually have changed a lot from when they were used in the past. And the example around Puffing Billy, who I learn't from an 88-year-old grandmother who was bringing her whole family on it, and she was just lovely. She said originally the rail line was cleared for I think about 9 meters either side of the rail, because the coal cinders, as the coal burns, can start bushfires. And that was how they stopped bushfires. Then, of course, it wasn't used for a long while and the forest grew back, as forest does. And now the fact that you can sit on the side of the train and touch the tree ferns as it go past is a key part of the experience. It's what I remember from my childhood. It's big. It's part of that whole, it's part of their marketing. Then you have to look at things that have to be changed or added to match modern context and expectations, including safety regulations. And one of the things that even back in 2008, Puffing Billy was already doing was converting at least one of its engines from coal to oil. And I think that was a non-fossil fuel oil, but don't quote me on that. But again, that was to avoid the cinders from the coal. And finally, the values people see in the machine may vary, both from each other's values, but also from the values of the past. And just as an example, I'll suggest 3 types of values that the people working together on Puffing Billy might see. One is the manager sees its costs as a negative value because they've got to pay the bills. So they're really concerned about, and interestingly, that's the value that's probably one of the closest to the past. People have always had to keep it running, so they've always worried about the cost and the bills. But now it's a tourist train, so we have visitors. They see it as entertainment, a fun day out. They don't see it as a functional thing, they see it as entertainment. And then there are all the volunteers, because it's heavily volunteer facilitated. And they see it, mostly, as I talk to, as a real opportunity to preserve an important piece of history and a place for them to share and use and propagate their skills. So the decision about whether it's appropriate or feasible to continue to run a heritage machine on fossil fuels might have different answers depending on the context, the person, and the person willing and able to put up the money to make that decision a reality. All right, so those things obviously could vary a lot between one owner and another. So I thought, well, okay, and I'm sorry, this is a bit of an ornery slide. I was desperately putting it together at about 10:30 this morning. I wanted to see how the Significance 2.0 process might help us in thinking about this. Thinking about what the significance might be to an owner of an operating heritage machine. And so we've got these ideas, historic, these are the classics. The primary ones are historic, which in relation to machines, I'll say what it did in the past. Artistic or aesthetic, which is mostly, people love the visual style of these gorgeous machines. Your scientific research or research potential. So what information do you want to get out of it? I've talked to some people who said, well, I'm not really interested in the history. I come to see what people have done with their next new vehicle, which is very different perhaps to how I would think of things. So spiritual, social, who do you feel it connects you to? And then I would add one, which is that interaction potential. And that's that opportunity for people to work on it, practice their skills, or to experience the sensory qualities that Natalie was talking about. Then, of course, if you know significance, the significance process, you'll know there's a comparative significance set of criteria. So provenance, okay, where did you get it from? Do you know who owned it in the past? Rarity or representativeness, do you think, oh, I got this, it's so, I have. Actually, I'm working with a guy at the moment who's just bought a Volvo because he says it's a rare coupe that they didn't make many of, they didn't send many to Australia. And I'm still thinking, okay, right, fine. Conditional completeness, whether it's in great condition or has most of its original parts. And don't get me started on what original means, but it has many meanings. But I would, and then interpretive capacity. What do you want to do with it as an owner? Do you want to drive it around? Do you want to take people for runs? Do you want to allow school groups to get inside it? And again, I'd add another one. So I'd add that cost and monetary value, because that affects what you can afford to do with it. It affects whether you can buy it in the first place. So I then thought I'd do a bit of a hypothetical. If we're thinking about this market aspect, and I know that I've talked to people who want to hand these things on to their kids, and they say, yeah, I know they may not be interested, but at least they can sell it. Well, if we have that possibility that maybe they can't sell it, where does that go? So I thought, consider a bloke who's retired and bought himself a car that he's then restored himself. For him, the key values might be its aesthetic appeal. He just loved this model when he was younger and he always wanted one. And its interaction potential. He loves working on it. He's restored it to working order himself. Interpretive capacity, he really loves driving it. Every drive involves showing it off and he gets to talk to people about it. And he also gets to listen and tweak the engine. I have had a conservation mechanic tell me every time this vehicle is turned on, we should be treating it as a diagnostic opportunity because I can listen to the noises and know whether anything's going wrong. Okay, this guy's so he'd like to. Oh yeah, and the cost is also a thing because in his case, the fuel might get expensive, but he can at least do all the maintenance himself because that's his thing. And that keeps the cost down. It also means he's not struggling to find a mechanic who still knows anything about internal combustion engines. Okay, he'd really like to hand this down to his son or his daughter. And he notes that it has monetary value. Okay, so his son hasn't ever been really interested in old cars. He has some really good memories of working on the thing with Dad, but he'd actually prefer to sell it. So his key values, I think, would probably be social. It connects him with his dad. And cost. He could sell it and buy that four-wheel drive that he wants for his dream, which is to go around Australia. So the guy's daughter, she loves the style of the car and she really actually regularly drives it. She loves talking to people about it, both about its history, but also about the story of her dad restoring it. She didn't do a lot of that mechanical work with him and she doesn't have the skills to keep it running herself. And the cost of fuel already means that she's driving it less this year. So she's been thinking about, well, could I convert it to an electric engine? It's not cheap, but it's perhaps on a par with some of the new cars I could buy. So I think her key values would be aesthetic appeal, this heritage style and feel, the interpretive capacity because she loves driving it and talking about it. Social, again, it connects her to her dad. Condition, she sees a potential change to an electric motor as part of its story. She thinks it's actually the part that is distinctively her chapter in its history. And the cost, she doesn't want to sell it, but she is worried about the costs of running it. So in this hypothetical, it's the daughter who's interested in keeping the car, but on her terms. So if her dad can accept that her values, the values she sees for herself in the different aspects, are in different aspects of the car to what he saw, if he can accept that and value her values, if you like, his succession plan can become a reality. And the car can remain an operating vehicle, albeit with some changes, but the history and monetary value of the car stays in the family. Okay, I'm going on a bit here.
Go on.
However, while adaptations to allow a historic car to be driven on today's roads and fulfill today's expectations are actually pretty common already, think safety compliant mirrors and lights and tyres, etc., the engine type has always been thought of as constant. Changing the engine type is thought of as conversion, which has negative connotations of stripping out history completely. And it is a big change, both physically and also in the intangible skills and intangible aspects. But in built heritage, we have this term called adaptive reuse. And that's actually got a really positive connotation, well, largely positive connotation. And there's extensive theory and precedent around it. And that adaptive reuse of a heritage building, as I put up on the slide, it implies retaining significant features from the past and integrating them with modern day features. And interestingly, the key features of a building that tend to get changed in an adaptive reuse plan are the mechanical aspects of a building. So while you retain the style, the machinery and the experience of key technical aspects, think washing clothes, getting water, cooking, and getting up to upper floors with lifts, they are the ones that are actually typically changed out because they don't fit today's requirements. So I guess the output of all of that is that we've been talking about our research program expanding to look more at these social questions. And can the sector move to seeing a machine as a diverse set of aspects of significance and to accepting that you have to choose which of all of these aspects you want to focus on because you can't have everything all at once? And secondly, is it helpful to reframe the debate about engine changes from the negative implications of conversion to the positive ones of adaptive reuse?
So we've focused a lot on cars because actually in our survey, they were our largest response, like machinery response that we got. And as Alison has mentioned, in order to make buildings safe, you work with the parameters of what you've got, preserve what you think is important, and make sure the experiences people have for them are consistently what the intent is. However, like I definitely know that there are people in our online audience, particularly who would be like, no, but you still need to maintain some of these mechanical aspects because that's part of the history too. So I'm like, why not both? Before we dip out of cars and into other things, I'm going to tell you about my car. When I was 20, I restored a 1964 Morris Mini Cooper with my grandfather. I ended up using Significance 2.0 after that, like relatively recently, as a tutor in the heritage conservation subject to work out what mattered to me because I let it moulder and I had to give it to somebody to do the mechanical work on because I don't have the space to do that, even though I probably have some of the skill sets. But one of the values that I got from that was the value of a community of practice and the transfer of intergenerational transfer of skills and ideas. And that was particularly down to my grandfather. I learned some really good stuff from him. So I was also contemplating in discussion with Alison here for this talk about, electric conversion. I'm not interested in that, which was really weird. Like my reaction to that was like, no. And there are differing opinions online as to whether minis are suitable for that because they're not very big. But there are some places who are making tailor-made electrical conversions for these things. Yeah. Anyway, so it is a possibility, but I'm actually not really keen on that. I am keen, though, to see what the outcomes of, any kind of drop-in fuels and development around that could be. Yeah. For a non-car, so let's get away from cars, and just harking back to what Alison said about boilers and trains and coal, one of the ways we see actioning of the trend towards scarcity of appropriate combustible fuel is in the UK heritage rail industry. And a lot of the time I can't have this conversation with people without them bringing this up. So that's not right. Go back. There we go. In Australia, from what I've been told, there are a lot less than 5 mines that supply coal for steaming purposes, as the size and quality of the coal is important for its heat and energy efficiency and therefore the reliability of the engine. Now, that quote is from an article about the UK heritage rail industry and the problems they've got. So, yeah. There are some trains that are being converted, as Alison has mentioned, and to tie the concepts of adaptive reuse in, Alison has also mentioned about the boilers. So sometimes in order to provide an experience, the functioning elements need to be serviced and changed out. And we've mentioned that if there's a boiler, there is a certain compliance measure that's non-negotiable. You have to have a boiler certified regularly to make sure that it's safe. So at what point this starts to impact the significance of the machine is an issue in some places. If it's providing as authentic an experience as it can within the parameters that you've given it, does it matter if its parts aren't 100% original? And some people do say, yeah, it does matter. And Alison was telling me about Dr. Luca Hoare, who has a PhD that looks at tanks in the Tank Museum in UK. I'm sorry if I got that wrong. And she talks about the intangible aura of historic objects. And yeah, that comes down in the discussions to original parts. She discusses many factors influencing when something would stop running and the tension between preservation of original parts and the experience of having something running. And this does also include safety to visitors and operators as the top priority. Now, yeah, differing opinions and standards of originality and authenticity of the experience and authenticity of parts is the kind of thing that got me followed home in my driveway when I was 22 by a Morris Mini Cooper enthusiast to tell me my boot lid was wrong, as well as feeling incredibly unsettled about this approach. I felt guilty. I felt guilty that my Mini wasn't up to this random person's standard. And depending on the car club I might join to register it, they might not actually care about the standard, or they might. Like, it depends. The New South Wales Roads and Traffic Authority in 2002 only cared that it was roadworthy. and I've just aged myself. That's great. But anyway, it needed to be roadworthy because it was my daily driver. I was not a member of a club. I drove it every day and I got stared at a lot, and it was an ego boost, but also a little bit daunting, and followed home because, you know, that happens. Researching this topic brings guilt in a number of aspects for me. Who am I to determine what's important? About my own vehicle? I think I'm probably the right person. About an operating machine in a museum collection? Now, that's a process for them too. They often use significance 2.0 as that is the standard, and it's quite a good standard. It makes things consistent across the country. When I worked at the places I worked, the significance object informed the treatment decisions. So I would liaise with a curator who would tell me the significance of the object. I would also do research, and then I would treat the object based on the significance that they told me was worthy of preserving. So this thing is subjective. And I'm going to say it again, as a number of students I have tutored throughout my years here can attest, I will scream into the room or the void, whichever one will listen, that heritage is subjective. And the decisions that we make about it are an involving subjective exercise where we create meaning by telling the story, and then we continue in a constructivist paradigm to recreate meaning by the way people interact with these things and what they mean to people. And it is an ongoing process. So we make decisions. Do we lock it? We make decisions. And some of these decisions could look like, do we lock it away because we're saving it for a rainy day? For an audience we don't know yet, and I'm in love with, there's a professor named Jane Henderson in the UK who writes about this extensively, and I love her. Another segue, a museum guide recently told me they had to now clarify to children in their museum whether they actually know what an internal combustion engine sounds like because they haven't grown up around them. They've grown up with electric cars. That example from home doesn't work anymore because of that. So our audience understanding of these things is also changing. Doesn't mean that it's disappearing, just means it's changing. So decisions, do we run it? Do we put it on static display because we're worried about losing it completely? Are we putting it on static display because we don't have the parts or the skill sets or the money to maintain it anymore? So for those people who don't know what static display is, it is not operating, it is in a museum or on a showground or in someone's front yard, just sitting there doing its interpretation that way. The operating component is no longer happening. So yeah, do we preserve what one engineer I have spoken to calls evidence of neglect? So those two photos, the one on the left and the one in the centre, could be evidence of neglect. They are minis I grew up playing in, and that is some rust strips on a crane. So yeah, do we preserve that? Or do we remove it? Do we make it bling and shiny? Do we paint it because painting it can protect it and interpret it? Like, yeah, whatever. Do we take another path? It comes down to context and significance, and Alison has outlined that brilliantly. This is also why in the survey we had a bunch of responses saying, sure, I reckon I convert my machine. But we also had a bunch of people saying, this would destroy me and my business. I really want a solution, because it comes down to the way we value our things, and that's not a one-size-fits-all proposal. It's subjective and it's nuanced. One more thing about guilt, and it might be the wrong word. I also feel guilt that I'm proposing to continue to run an internal combustion engine while the world burns, and that's why the first part of our two-part question is still important.
So just to finish up, I think what we've come to sort of understand in our own research, and I hope we've been able to give you a taste of today, is that we think that we need to help people articulate what they want to do with their vehicles a bit more explicitly, and to allow
differentiation in those assets that they're
considering important, because that is a way to see other people's values and to find some bridges between your own values and other people's values. I think that this could end up with an operating heritage machinery sector where people actually pride themselves on and see a value-added proposition in defining which aspect of their machine's significance they've chosen to preserve or restore, and which intangible aspects of its heritage that will then enable them to experience. And if we can reframe the aspect of the motive power for a machine from seeing it as an absolutely defining aspect of a machine's significance, more significant than everything else, to one of a diverse set of aspects, perhaps we can provide a new perspective on helping the sector cope with change, very fast change, and accepting the option of adaptive reuse as a realistic path could perhaps help that sector cope with those rising fuel costs and limited fuel availability, and with a potential, perhaps that would prevent a potential loss in value of heritage machines if people stop them just being seen as too hard to deal with, create some other ways of dealing with them so people have got more options, and so that those options are acceptable to the community. And that doesn't mean stripping out every internal combustion engine, but it does mean accepting that vehicles modified to perhaps be carbon neutral can be exciting and really nuanced projects. Like you were saying, that it's hard to fit an electric motor in a Mini, but that's a puzzle for somebody who wants to do that.
And people are already solving that.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Done with it.
But still, those things can add to the history of the machine.
And
really
not destroy it, but add something positive.
And if you choose not to convert your machines, if there are alternatives that are significantly less harmful to the environment and reduce our emissions that still allow our machines to provide the experiences they do, that keep them out of landfill, that allow people to meet and chat and transfer knowledge and just demonstrate their skill sets while still getting the thump thump and the boom boom sensation transferring from the engine to their body, the smell of smoke, the wind in their hair when they run it. I reckon that's something worthwhile to work through. And that's it. Thanks.
Thank you. Any questions for Alison and Natalie?
First, thank you so much. I thought it was really interesting and important in all sorts of ways. Just two comments. The first one is I happened to come across Guibert Simondon recently. I don't know whether that informs you, but what fascinated me about his ideas as a philosopher of technology was this idea of the two layers, that you have the layer which is changeable. In fact, in modern technology, it's the one that gets updated every 10 minutes. And then you get this technology below it, which is constant and the essence of what that technology is. And I just thought that might be interesting if you're not aware of Simondon's work, to have a look at that. The other thing is our dear colleague JP Gagnon in BGL has converted his much loved car to electric, and I'm sure he'd be a very interesting person to interview.
Thank you. Thank you. I wasn't aware of that philosopher, actually, and we'll go now and find him and look into it. I will say that I think that I think that with physical mechanical machines, there's perhaps more interaction between the surface and the sublayer. I get what you're saying, but it's if you change things, like if you change a component out, it affects like the weight. So changing an engine from an internal combustion to an electric engine is going to affect the weight and the ride and all those sorts of things. So
that reminds me of diagrams that I saw when I used to work in the telecommunications industry, where you had like the base layer, which was the infrastructure that you ran it on, and then all your programming, yeah.
Interesting point. Thank you.
My question is, as somebody who doesn't know a lot about EV, so I might be veering off in the wrong direction completely. I guess you mentioned about how they might be like looking into alternative fuel where they're not using the fossil part, but they're finding a different way of getting the carbon, whatever. And I guess I was just wondering, I mean, in terms of, talking about like net zero projections and stuff, and I think you'd mentioned that they talk about wanting to convert, have everything running whatever % electric or whatever, and obviously converting cars to electric versus using a different fuel, those are two very big different things, and can obviously deeply influence the whole area. So I guess what I was curious about is the main method that's being examined to, like, is there this huge push for electric? Like, is this what it seems like we're supposed to be expecting electric, or is it their potential for other things to be cropping up?
There's a whole bunch of things. So things like hydrogen fuel cells and and so forth are also in the mix. And the e-fuels that I was talking about are actually interesting because they're a drop-in replacement for the existing fossil fuels in that they're created with carbon. It's just the carbon it draws stuff out of the air, so it's drawing on a short carbon cycle rather than the long, deep one where we pull stuff out of the earth from years ago. But so there are a whole bunch of different ones. I think the thing that's we expected a much slower changeover where a lot of these things had time to find their way into the market and people had time to adjust to them. But if that's all going to happen within 2 to 5 years, that's a really short time frame.
One of the other things is that I've just used what they're proposing for the light vehicle fleet, which is our cars and our motorbikes and that kind of stuff, whereas there are a bunch of other things that are in that roadmap. And I guess the one that I'm probably talking about when I say this is aviation, because there isn't right now, as far as I'm aware, and I could be wrong, a feasible electric plane solution. So those fuels are going to need to be developed for other sectors. And so they potentially will be available for the sectors that aren't being proposed to use them. So yeah, I'm not a very fabulous government policy person, but I'm under the impression that there is a lot of nuance that they have to work out through that. But from that document, I've extrapolated that their 2035 to 2050 window is that the light vehicle fleet is what they are looking at making predominantly electric.
Also, to add to that, one thing that we did want to go and ask those production companies is your carbon drawdown fuels. Are they just petrol? Like they're being used quite a bit in Europe and I think the UK. But is it just a petrol equivalent, or do they do diesel as well? And do they do avgas as well? Or can they do those things? Or is that a whole different development process? Don't know. So we have an online one, which Owen's going to read out in a moment.
Yeah. Converting my 300-year-old cars from IC to electric makes them worthless to me as historic objects and as machines that I enjoy. Whoops.
Is that?
I enjoy their old engines running. I will pay more for fuel.
Yeah.
Or make minor adaptations to run them on oil fuel.
That was definitely not an uncommon response. That was a common response in our survey as well, that people would, and I think I'm one of them, people will pay money to allow for these things to continue to run because the way that they run currently and the smells they make and the work they do on them is what makes them special to those people. Yeah, so I hope that answers your question, but I agree.
Maybe they'd be too purist. Well, purist than a adaptive reuse.
I did get that vibe that there are schools of differing thought throughout this, and I mean we're demonstrating one here. I still have an ICE vehicle. Alison has an electric vehicle, so we're straddling that well.
But yeah, as you say, perhaps not purist, but certainly people who prefer to keep the internal combustion engine, even if there come to be challenges with fuel availability. And that's part of the diversity and part of the interest of this area. It's not that we want to change everything to electric, but just to perhaps make it not such a guilt thing if people do make that decision, because that is their way. Their way of going about it. You're into adaptive reuse, yeah. You are actually, yes, that's very much.
Thanks for that. That was great. I'm a museum background, Alex Marsden, but also very pragmatic as well as principled. So can we, and I understand people wanting to keep the whole significance of it and the feeling, but what about, and the question is size of the problem that we're talking about, or the size of the industry. So we're looking at airplanes, we're looking at heritage railways, which might actually have quite a significant effect on the environment or might not, or we're looking at heritage cars, which really don't. If we make one significant change to one industrial area, we're not going to worry about your mini miner, are we, really?
But I think that was the main thing that we kind of came up against. Like when people stop using these things and they cease to be more popular, they become harder to get. So not saying that there is that 100% of the population is on board with this particular way of using energy, I think is what we're trying to see if we can
But
factor in.
my question is, should they be? I mean, or should we be worried about only 80% are on board and 20% is really not going to have a material impact on the environment compared to, you know, major peninsulas or something?
They are a very small percentage.
Yeah.
And because of that, that's really why this project started. Because of that, no one's going to keep their extraction and refining and distribution capabilities up for this sector because it's tiny. So it's not, that's where we started. It's not really about whether you should or shouldn't run your old vehicle on fossil fuels. It's about whether you'll actually be able to, because they're not important in the calculations made by these big companies.
I think from what we can see what's happening in the world, we're not going to run out of fossil fuel extractions anytime soon.
That's so something that we're looking at because, like,
I mean, there are from Australian federal government it's a program force get they rely on fossil fuels, whether that will be available to people living in Australia, like
whether it's just shipped in exclusively for those industries that still use them is something that I'm interested in looking at. Yeah, but it's a good point.
We have had people from museums saying, oh, we'll get exemptions. But as Natalie says, well, maybe in an evolving situation, they won't. Or just the fact that the normalisation of a different approach to energy usage means that they struggle to make the messages clear to their audiences. Maybe it just means that they're going to have to work a lot harder with that.
I think we're about out of time. So if we can carry on talking over coffee, that would be great. Let's thank Alison and Natalie again. Thank you.